Daniel was warned that the trail was evil, but he just laughed it off. That was before the rumors began, before the trees surrounded him. Daniel enjoyed hiking. He had walked some of the hardest trails in the country, but nothing thrilled him more than Raven's Hollow, a path deep in the Oklahoma desert. The locals gave him a warning about it. They talked about walkers who disappeared and weird sounds in the trees. But Daniel ignored their warnings as old stories. With a plan and his emergency gear, he left early in the morning. The first few miles were lovely. Sunlight came through the tall trees, and birds sang above. The air was fresh and cool, but something seemed off. By the 5th mile, a thick fog moved in, hiding the trees in a cloudy mist. The ground under his feet felt wet, like it was alive. Then the whispers started. At first, Daniel thought it was just the wind, but the voices were clear, quiet, and full of urgency. Go back. Don't look. Go. He stopped suddenly, heart racing. He turned around, thinking he would see someone. There was no one there, just endless trees disappearing into the fog. He tried to let it go and kept walking down the path. But as he continued, everything felt more and more strange. The trees were not in their usual spots. The way he came from was gone. Panic started. He looked at his map, but it was confusing. The locations didn't line up. Did he stray off the path? Then he saw it. A person stood between the trees. Tall. Gaunt. Its arms and legs are too long. Its eyes are dark holes. It stayed still, but Daniel felt it stare looking right at him. He gasped. He moved back. The figure copied his actions. Then it smiled. Daniel ran. The whispers grew into laughter around him. The fog deepened, blinding him. He tripped, crashing to the ground. His backpack opened up. When he looked up, he saw a large person above him. Its face twisted into an exaggerated smile. You shouldn't be here. He was engulfed in darkness. The next morning, guards discovered Daniel's backpack at the start of the path. His tracks went into the forest, but there were no footprints leading away. When Mia glanced in the mirror, her image smiled back at her, but she hadn't moved a finger. Mia just moved into her new apartment, which is small but cute and located downtown. The last person who lived here left an old mirror in the bedroom. The frame is fancy and has odd carvings on it. She thought it was beautiful, until the strange things began. The first event was minor. One night, while she was brushing her hair, she looked away from the mirror. For just a moment, her reflection stayed still. It remained still, looking at her. She took it lightly and laughed. It's just something I made up. The next night, she saw something even more troubling. Her reflection blinked, but she didn't. She felt a shiver down her back. She looked away, saying to herself that she was just tired. Then the rumors started. Late at night, she heard soft, faraway whispers coming from the mirror. She put her ear against the glass. Please let me go. She pulled away, her heart racing. She took a blanket and covered the mirror, not wanting to see it again. At 3 a.m., she heard a strange noise and woke up. A gentle, steady tapping sound. Mia sat up and looked at the mirror that was covered. The tapping got louder. Then the blanket fell to the floor. Her reflection looked different. It smiled at her with a sneaky, understanding grin. It slowly lifted a hand and touched the glass. Mia took a sharp breath. The surface moved in waves like water. Then her mirror came out. She tried to scream, but something held her throat. It drew her towards the mirror. The last thing she saw was her own face, now inside the glass, beating against it. The next morning, her owner discovered her in bed, grinning, but her eyes looked blank. As she walked by the mirror, her mirror didn't appear. A late-night taxi ride should feel safe. What if the guest is not a person? Jason had been a cab driver for many years, giving rides to many different types of people. But he would always remember the woman wearing a red dress. It was after midnight when he saw her standing on the side of a deserted road, her long hair partially hiding her face. She lifted her light-colored hand. Jason stopped the car. "Where would you like to go, miss?" She spoke so softly that it was almost a whisper. "Bring me home." She gave him an address located far from the city, in a remote area. As they drove, Jason kept looking at her in the mirror. Her skin was too pale, her lips bloodless. She sat very still with her hands in her lap. The car became colder. Jason felt cold and rubbed his arms to warm up. His breath made the glass foggy. Then he saw something. Her image in the mirror. It wasn't present. He gripped the wheel tighter. "Excuse me, are you?" She looked around. Her face changed in a way that looked unnatural. Her mouth opening wide like a dark hole. "Keep driving," she whispered fiercely. Jason pressed the gas pedal hard, his heart racing. The road curved in unexpected ways. His GPS flickered, showing a road that wasn't there. He finally arrived at his destination. An old, falling-apart house at the end of a dirt road. She went outside. "You brought me home," she said softly. Then she disappeared. Jason's hands shook as he drove quickly away. His heart was still racing when he got to the city. Then he looked in his rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat, grinning. Jason did not work the night shift anymore. As soon as Ethan entered the empty cabin, he felt a cold shiver. The air smelled like wet wood and something metal, something decayed. The door creaked shut behind him, unprompted. He stopped suddenly. He had company. Ethan and his best friend, Lucas, were exploring in a thick forest when a sudden storm made them look for a place to stay dry. They found an old house in the woods. Its broken windows and walls covered in moss made it look creepy. But the storm was strong outside, so they had to stay inside. "This place freaks me out," Lucas said quietly, using his flashlight to look around the dusty room. The room was filled with broken furniture, torn curtains, and old, damaged books. The fireplace was cold, but there was a light smell of burnt wood in the air. Ethan looked at a wooden chair in the corner. It was rocking, slowly, going back and forth. However, there was no wind inside. "Did you watch that?" Ethan spoke quietly. Lucas's flashlight blinked as he pointed it at the chair. It ceased to move. The room was filled with a heavy and uncomfortable silence. "This isn't right," Lucas whispered. Let's wait by the door until the storm passes. As they turned, a loud groan came from the hallway at the back of the house. A shadow moved quickly across the doorway. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped. It moved so fast that it vanished before they could see it clearly. "Did you watch that?" Lucas asked while holding on to Ethan's arm. Ethan nodded, his throat felt dry. His heart raced. He felt a strong urge to leave, but the storm outside was still very strong. The wind blew loudly, shaking the broken windows. Something scraped along the walls. "Slow. Think carefully." Lucas stepped into the hallway. "We should take a look," he whispered. Ethan held onto his arm. "Are you crazy?" "We should stay here." Lucas paused, then nodded. They gathered close to the door, waiting. Minutes seemed like hours. The storm kept going strong. Then people started to talk. Soft, unclear sounds filled the cabin. Ethan and Lucas looked at each other in fear. The comments were coming from all around them. Lucas aimed his flashlight toward the hallway again. The beam flickered, then cut out totally. The chair began to rock again. This time it kept going. A big bang came from upstairs. Then slow footsteps were heard. Every step made a creaking sound, as if something heavy was moving. Above them, Lucas struggled with his flashlight, breathing heavily. "That's all. We're going now." He went to grab the door handle. It wouldn't move. They heard a rough breathing sound behind them. Ethan turned around slowly. His stomach turned. A figure stood in the dark, thin and hollow-eyed, with skin tightly pulled over its bones. Its mouth formed a strange smile. It lifted a long, hooked finger and pointed at Ethan. The door flew open on its own. The wind howled through the shack, extinguishing the weak lighting that they had barely noticed. In the corner, Ethan and Lucas ran outside in a panic, rushing into the storm without turning around. The next morning, when they came back with the town officials, the cabin had disappeared. Not left behind, not damaged. It's gone, like it never existed. That night, I shouldn't have picked up the phone, but when it rang at 3 a.m., I had to answer it no matter. "What? The other person's voice? Yours? But I was asleep just before that." Jason Carter wasn't sure about things. Horror, ghost stories, and other strange stories never scared him. That changed the night he and his friend Ryan went to the empty Holloway asylum to look around. It had been shut down for decades because of a string of horrible patient deaths and strange events that no one could explain. People in the town talked about it behind closed doors. They told stories about shadows moving on their own, strange laughter resonating through the halls, and doors slamming shut without notice. Jason didn't believe any of it, up until that night. The hospital was on the edge of town, and there was a thick fog that made it hard to see with lanterns. The entry was huge and looked like it was ready to swallow them whole. The broken gates were hanging open. "You sure about this?" Ryan asked in a quiet voice. Jason looked down. "All right, man. It's just an old house. Let's go inside, look around, and then leave." Simple. As they walked inside, the sound of their steps echoed off the broken tiles. Heavy, still air filled with the smell of death and something else, metallic like old blood. The water got cooler as they went deeper. Then they heard it. A whisper. Feel faint. It was almost like someone breathing near their ears. Jason quickly turned around. Did you hear that? Ryan said yes, and his grip on his torch got tighter. Probably the wind, but there wasn't any wind. They kept going until they got to what looked like an old dorm for patients. The walls were lined with rusty bed frames that no longer had pillows on them. Then Jason saw it. An old rotary phone sitting on a desk in the middle of the room, untouched by time. It went off. They were startled by a sharp, shrill sound that went straight through them. Ryan moved back. Dude, let's get out of here. But Jason reached out and picked up the receiver. He did this out of a mix of fear and interest. Still, after that, breathe. Deeply, slowly. Then I heard a voice. There's Jason. Why did you come here? He dropped the phone as his heart beat fast against his chest. It got too cold in the room to stand. Ryan pulled on his arm. We're leaving now. As they turned to run, the lights above them flickered. They were old neon bulbs that had not worked in decades but were now living. Shadows moved in strange ways along the walls, twisting and wriggling. Then, people began to laugh. First, it was low and almost fun. Then it got worse. Voices piled on top of each other, growing into something scary. With each step they took, the hallway behind them got longer and the escape got farther away. Jason felt something touch his shoulder. Cold hands. There was a whisper in his ear. Stay. As they ran for the door, he pulled himself forward and almost pulled Ryan with him. As soon as they got to the door, it slammed shut, locking them inside. Ryan worked hard on it. Help! Someone! Jason turned around, and his breath shook. The shadows were moving, creeping towards them and changing into hazy shapes that looked like people. They each spoke, a voice that Jason knew. You were never supposed to leave. The world went dark. Jason was by himself when he woke up. The hospital was quiet, and there were a lot of hallways. The door was gone. The phone then rang again.